And now today's featured speaker is Bentley University Senior Lecturer Asbed Kotchikian. Professor Kotchikian is a Senior Lecturer in the Global Studies Department at Bentley University, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and former Soviet Union. He has written, lectured, presented, and organized conferences on questions of identity and transformation of transnational diasporic groups, foreign policies of small and weak states, national identity and regional developments in the Middle East and Eurasia. His book, entitled The Dialectics of Small States, Foreign Policymaking in Armenia and Georgia, was published in 2008. Without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Professor Asbed Kotchikian.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for the Office of Alumni and Family Engagement as well. And thanks for everyone who is following today. I will try to be brief. I will try to provide some basic background for those who don't know where Lebanon was until the blast. Just some basic background information which are also relevant to the issue of what we're witnessing in Lebanon today and the possible future scenarios and developments. Very small country with a large population. The problem is, however, in Lebanon, no one knows what the real population is, because the last census that was taken was in 1932, when Lebanon was under French mandate, French colonial rule. The reason for this is political, mostly because of the fact that no one wants to know what is the current population and what is the current sectarian divide or current sectarian numbers in the country. And when we talk about Lebanon, a famous historian once said that Lebanon is a house of many mansions. It's basically a country that is very diverse in a sectarian way. Officially, there are 18 recognized sects, Muslim and Christian sects. And from that perspective, it is quite a difficult sort of act of balance going on in the country. It has been going on in the last 70 years or so to keep the political system and to keep the overall political balance in place. Very briefly, Lebanon was created in its current borders after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In 1918, the French and the British divided the Middle East amongst themselves, and the French took Lebanon and Syria. And in 1920, they declared that there is a new Lebanon. But it was completely toothless. It was unsovereign. It was all governed by French authorities. And it was during that period, that the French conducted a survey and came up with an idea that, okay, according to the 1932 survey, there were basically 6 Christians for every 5 Muslims. And they used that as a way for governing the country. Basically, from that point until 1989, the Lebanese parliament has always been, the number of the deputies in the Lebanese parliament has always been a multiple of 11. So for every 6 Christian, there would be 5 Muslims. Later on, that changed. Now the representation is 1-to-1. But one has to also keep in mind that in that context, when you say Christian versus Muslim, there are so many subdivisions in each sect as well. So for instance, among the Christian sects, the Maronites are the largest. You have Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic. These are not Greek, they're Arabs, but they follow the Greek Orthodox church rites and the Greek Catholic church rites. Protestants, Armenian Orthodox or Apostolic Church. You have the Sunni, the Shia, the Druze, who are not necessarily Muslim group, but they're categorized as Muslims. As part of this structure, one of the things that it's an unwritten rule, it is not written in anywhere in the Constitution, but there was something called the National Pact, where the 3 main groups, the Maronites, the Sunni, and the Shia, divided the top 3 posts among themselves, and that has been basically standardized. So according to this agreement, the president has to always be a Maronite, the prime minister has to always be a Sunni, and the Speaker of the House has to always be a Shia. Lebanon became independent in 1943. So the last 77 years, basically the Middle East, or sometimes as I would call it, the Muddle East, has been always unstable. Lebanon, because of its size and lack of importance per se, was never took part in these turmoil, but it was always a battleground among all the different countries, not only regionally, but also internationally. In that sense, they were always using Lebanon as proxy. Big countries, excuse me, big countries or regional powers were using Lebanon as a battleground to settle their score. This whole thing led to the civil war in Lebanon between 1975 and 1990. That ended, that destroyed the country, divided the country, created a lot of animosities, hatred, grievances, and so on. But in 1990, the civil war ended with outside interference, with the occupation of the Syrian army of all of Lebanon. And things started going back to quote unquote normal, the new normal. Since then, Lebanon has had its ups and downs, never a major news item in global news, but there were a lot of the grievances that existed manifested themselves in sectarian sort of animosities, sectarian tension, sometimes even assassinations. Usually the preferred form of assassination had been the car bombs, which also resulted in many, many collateral damages. And since the early 2000s, mid 2000s, especially after the Arab Spring started, Lebanon became again part of the larger regional unstable fabric. There is a relatively famous Iranian-American comedian, Maj Jobrani. In one of his stand-ups a couple of years ago, in 2010 or 11, he basically jokingly said, you know, there's something wrong in the Middle East when Lebanon is the most stable country in the region. That captures the essence of what it was. Of course, now Lebanon is far from being stable. What have we been witnessing that led to these crises and basically the straws that have been accumulating on the back of the Lebanese camel, if you want to call it? First of all, the issue of leadership malaise. One thing that one has to keep in mind in Lebanon when talking about politics in Lebanon is that it follows a dynastic, confessional, familial system. In other words, when you talk about political parties are more often than not represented by sects. So you can have more than one political party in one sect, but it's almost difficult to find. You might find some individuals, anecdotal cases of, for instance, a Christian, regardless of what a sect they are, being a member of a political party that is predominantly Sunni or Shia or Druze. But at the end of the day, political parties were superimposed on confessional systems. And also, another factor is that the Lebanese leadership, political leadership, more often than not, they are the sons, grandsons of those who were actually the political actors of Lebanon in the last 40, 50, 60 years. So this is something that actually has led to leadership malaise in a sense that people know that this is politics as usual. You know, the father will be gone, the son will take over. The son will be gone, the junior will be over. Of course, in very, very, very few cases, you know, extremely few cases, it would be a woman taking over the leadership. So it's male-dominated, dynastic politics. That being said, after the war, Lebanon went into a huge reconstruction plan. A lot of investments coming in to remake Lebanon the Paris of the East again. A lot of foreign investments, mostly spearheaded by late Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, who was a businessman and actually was an outsider in that political system. He was a completely political maverick. He didn't have anything to do with the existing system. So he basically encouraged foreign investment to rebuild Lebanon, but that came with a price. I have to mention here briefly that Prime Minister Hariri, the Rafik Hariri, was assassinated on February 14, 2005. And just today, an international tribunal actually passed the judgment or issued its judgment about the causes of that. I don't want to go into that. We can deal with it in the Q&A session. So reconstruction happening, but it was an uneven distribution of wealth. The wealth disparity was increasing, and the Lebanese kept on, you know, accepting the political system more or less, because the confessional system was so deeply rooted in the political fabric that it was inconceivable that any change would happen. That is until 2019, last year in October, when the government, a new government was formed in Lebanon after a long period of negotiations, and they decided that in order to pay off Lebanese debt, the national debt, they're going to start imposing taxes on voice over IP phones, especially WhatsApp. For those of you who are not familiar, for those of us who live in the United States, we might not use it that often, but WhatsApp is a voice over IP phone system that actually is very, very useful to communicate with people who live overseas, with family, and so on. So they decided, the government, that they're going to impose a tax on the voice on WhatsApp. People took on the streets. This was a truly sort of popular in a sense that it crossed boundaries, sectarian boundaries. It was called the WhatsApp Revolution. It didn't lead to much results except that a new government was put in place, and that new government still struggled with the issues of socioeconomic challenges. Added to this was basically a US-led sanction on Lebanon, mostly because of the issue of Hezbollah. Some of you might know Hezbollah as being a terrorist group. Others would claim that it is a militia. They are labeled as terrorists by the United States and European Union, but not by others. Regardless, Hezbollah is probably the biggest Shia political force in Lebanon. They are also probably the only one that has armed sort of militias, and they could influence political processes in Lebanon. Now, because of the sanctions on Lebanon, the problem is that when the United States or other countries want to put sanctions on Hezbollah, they cannot realize, and most of them don't realize, that Hezbollah is part of the political fabric. It's so integrated into the Lebanese political fabric that you could not say, okay, I'm going to put sanctions on Hezbollah. But that also meant putting sanctions on Lebanon overall. Banks that were doing businesses with Hezbollah, people who were doing businesses with Hezbollah. All of this eventually started a major economic problem. Within the last 6-7 months, even less so in the last 4 months or so, the Lebanese currency was devaluated by 85%. Inflation rose by 55%. The number of people living below the poverty line was 45% of the population, and unemployment was almost 35%. So this was quite a dire situation, socioeconomic situation in Lebanon. Add to that the fact of COVID-19. COVID-19 basically forced the government to shut down businesses, to shut down social distancing, introduce social distancing and so on. But at the end of the day, they managed to control it up until recently. For some comparison, Lebanon has recorded about 9,000 cases of COVID-19. However, since the explosion, the numbers have been going up. And this is mostly because of the fact that a lot of hospitals and medical centers were destroyed. A lot of people, rescuers, were basically working without masks. So for just comparison purposes, before the explosion, the highest case, if I'm not mistaken, of COVID-19 cases happening in a single day was about 65 people. That was in May. And since then it dropped. The government was doing a good job relatively with the limited resources that they had. On August 6th, 2 days after the explosion, by the way, this presentation is taking place exactly 2 weeks to the hour of the explosion that occurred in Lebanon, in the port of Lebanon, in the port of Beirut. So on August 6th, 2 days after the explosion, the numbers in a single day were 255 cases of COVID-19. On August 11, according to sources, official sources, there have been 300 cases of COVID-19. So as you can see, obviously, when we talk about any kind of a tragedy, any kind of a man-made tragedy or destruction, the repercussions or the reverberations take place or move on quite more. I just want to touch upon briefly about the port and the explosion. The main port in Lebanon, Beirut port, has been on and off, in place for many years, over a century. However, because of the existing political system in Lebanon, confessional system, but also nepotism, add to that the division of spoils, different parts of the government or different parts of sectarian leaders and different political leaders have a stake or have had some claim on an income from government resources, including the port, Beirut's port. What happened? I'm not going to go into the details. One knows it's impossible to filter out the conspiracy theories and so on. People even having like an emoji of a rocket showing that this was a rocket explosion rather than an explosion. The short story of it was that about 3,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate were confiscated almost 6-7 years ago from a vessel passing through the port, and they were put in a warehouse. And because of humidity, because of lack of proper conditions to store these, that warehouse and the ammonium nitrate became highly unstable. Now this is where the stories diverge. No one knows what really happened, but it is to some certainty clear that a fire started in one of the neighboring warehouses, in a nearby warehouse, when some construction workers were welding and so on. Now that fire went into one of the warehouses. It started a huge fire. Firefighters came and they were trying to deal with the fire, and then the fire expanded to the ammonium nitrate. For those of us, or most of us, who are not, who haven't majored in chemistry or do not know about making bombs, I hope no one does, but ammonium nitrate, other than being a fertilizer, it is also a major ingredient in explosives. Highly unstable in humidity, and Lebanon, Beirut is very humid. That fire basically expanded and blew up, the city. The blame game, obviously everyone started looking for conspiracy theories, but also everyone trying to blame the others. But one of the things at this point that most people agree is that this has been nothing more than a gross and criminal negligence by successive governments in Lebanon. They didn't pay attention to the storage protocols. They didn't pay attention to how things are, how things should be processed, and so on. Bottom line, adding to the socioeconomic problems, the COVID-19 case. Now, because of the explosion, according to latest figures, approximately 200 people were killed. The number is increasing based on, based on the injured, sustaining injuries that they couldn't recover from. Over 6,000 people's injured at various intensity. 300,000 people are rendered homeless, either directly, either because their homes are completely destroyed or are uninhabitable. And according to some estimates, the actual damage, just the damage now, the physical damage that exists, is about $15 billion. This is not to mention about the operating expenses or losses, because the Beirut harbor is not, the Beirut port is not functional. I met, just for you, those of you again who haven't looked at the pictures and so on, this is the Beirut port before the explosion. And basically, this is it afterwards. And you can see the crater that was created from the explosion. Everything was obliterated in major, all directions. Some experts mentioned that the fact that you had this by the sea, and that if you can see by the bottom, at the bottom of the picture, there's a grain silos. The grain silo and the sea absorbed approximately 70% of the shock wave. And the destruction that was created was mostly by the 30% of the shock wave. Major economic disaster, major human disaster, forget about the economy. Because Beirut port is the main source of the country, a country that doesn't produce much, that has to import most of its resources, food and so on, is gone. The Lebanese folklore, they like to talk about the phoenix, that Beirut, the phoenix, the bird phoenix. And for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, you know the Order of Phoenix and so on. I'm not going to talk about the details of the phoenix, the mythical animal, but they say Beirut has been destroyed so many times. The city has been destroyed so many times, but it always rises from the ashes like a phoenix. The problem is, the question is now, is it possible to do that or not? Immediately after the explosion, one of the things that at least I've been observing is that resurfacing of those protests and the grievances that existed before the explosion. Incompetent governments, successive incompetent governments, basically officials who are more interested in taking a share from the pie rather than distributing the wealth and so on. These became so big that protesters after the explosion stormed government buildings. The government resigned. Lebanon does not have a government now. No one wants to take responsibility, so they've resigned, waiting an investigation, waiting a verdict as to what's going to happen. International pledges have been coming in. This is great in a sense that, yes, you have a major disaster. France spearheaded this, probably maybe feeling guilty of their colonial past, but also the special connection that the Lebanese, many Lebanese feel with France. France spearheaded a European Union global meeting where they pledged about €250 million, 250 million euros in immediate aid, and in terms of medical aid, in terms of food and other resources, engineers, rescuers. A lot of people are still stuck under rubbles. They do not have the means to, the limited resources that Lebanon has. Two major hospitals, for instance, were completely destroyed. Obviously, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about COVID-19, where people are isolated in wards. When the hospital is gone, obviously, you cannot contain them. They had to take patients to cities, or to locations, hospitals, 100 miles away, and so on, to be able to deal with the humanitarian crisis. But one of the biggest questions that exists today as well, that at this point the international donors are not raising, is that if we're going to give aid, who are we going to give it to? Clearly, the government doesn't have the trust, or the politicians don't have the trust of the people. And clearly, they're having cases of corruption and basically people, pocketing money and so on. So this is one of the biggest problems. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently in relation to this is in 2010, a huge earthquake hit Haiti, followed by a big tsunami. And the international community gathered, and Haiti was, even before those, was in a really problematic situation, socially, financially, economically, politically. And there were over $15 billion pledged to rebuild Haiti. 10 years later, not much of that has been actualized, not because of the pledges didn't come in, some of it came, but then at the end of the day, a lot of these issues, a lot of the people who were handling it were still doing things the way they did before. Thinking about positive things, some of the stories that I've been hearing from people on the ground, talking with people, relatives, friends, and people who have been involved in rescuing and rescue operations and so on, is that citizens, actually, individuals, took initiative before even the government did. Government with all its agencies, or whatever agencies, institutions it has. They were a lot of groups of young people going and distributing water, food, but also taking part under the supervision of the Lebanese army to cleaning apartments, cleaning houses, cleaning broken glass, and so on and so forth. One of the things I keep hearing is that there are no glasses in Lebanon anymore, to replace the glasses, broken windows, and so on and so forth. So from this perspective, it was empowering to see young people and mostly young people, and from all walks of life, from different sects, trying to help each other in this common tragedy. Um, at least humanity is not lost in Lebanon when it comes to helping each other. And the final thought that I want to leave, I want to finish my presentation with, is that this is a perfect opportunity for Lebanon to reset its politics, its society, and so on. The growing anger, the frustration by people, the challenges that individuals face has basically has reached its limit. So the question is, what kind of a reset it would be? Is it going to be international intervention or not? At this day, and at this time, because of COVID-19 and other reasons, I failed to see a major international intervention. But the change of the political system is a must. As I say, I try to be positive, but the challenge for this is so big because, as I said earlier, the political confessional nepotist system is so deeply entrenched in Lebanese politics that one has to always ask the question, who are going to be the new leaders? Leaders who are basically immaculate of this corruption, immaculate of the basically participation in the existing system of dividing the spoils and so on. And I would like to end it at that and try to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. We do have some questions pre-submitted, so I will definitely start with those. But if you have questions now, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. We'll start with the first question, which was pre-submitted, and you definitely just touched on this, but are Lebanon's security and institutions strong enough to be impartial to foreign and domestic factions, avoiding civil war?
Well, the short answer for that is no. But then do not underestimate the will and the anger and the determination of the people now in terms of setting these new institutions. The Lebanese politicians for the longest time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, mostly until the 70s, they used to be this line that Lebanon's strength is in its weakness. Because Lebanon is weak, it doesn't threaten any country in the neighborhood or in the region, neighbors, and so on, then that's why they were going to be left alone. And people do leave them alone. However, the problem was that the Lebanese weakness was in its weakness. There was, because of confessional system, state institutions were not built, were not, the sense of belonging to a state, that you trust state. Instead, if you have a problem, if you live in a neighborhood, if you have a problem, you don't go to the police, you don't go to the state institutions, you go to your local sort of strong person, a militia leader, not a militia leader, but the confessional leader. And that has created major problems throughout. There was one attempt made in the 50s to break the confessional system when a president was elected, Fuad Shahab, who was trying to create a sense of Lebanese identity rather than confessional identities. But most of the other confessional leaders, they ganged it up. They didn't want him. And in the following presidential election, they got rid of him and reinstituted a confessional system, which in essence weakens state institutions.
Thanks, Asbed. And this person, this is a live question now. This person says, as you said, at some point it goes beyond charity and the international support. So how can foreign companies and actors help people develop economically and get money to citizens directly?
Well, that is one of the biggest problems, isn't it? Again, yes, charity is, immediate. I wouldn't call it charity, it's relief at this point. You have to also consider that there is a large number of Lebanese expats, large number. There are more Lebanese who live outside of Lebanon than they do in Lebanon, or Lebanese ethnicity or origin. They've been sending remittances and so on. This is part of the reset that I mentioned. There has to be an economic, political, social sort of resetting of the whole system. I'm not an economist. I don't know how would that be. Construction it's in and by itself is an opportunity for people to work, but not everyone works in construction. What about people who, even before the explosion, could barely get their food? They could barely, pay for basic needs and so on and so forth. 35% of the population living below poverty line is not a small thing. And there are examples, I leave it for economists to come up with analogies, but there are a lot of countries that have managed to pull themselves out by sound political, sound economic policies, but at the same time, putting aside, their own self-interest and self-preservation.
And of course, all of this is happening during a global pandemic, as you mentioned. So how has the explosion impacted the country's handling of COVID-19?
As I mentioned earlier, the numbers have increased tremendously. I was speaking with an individual in Lebanon who's a doctor who claimed, I cannot verify, but who claimed that at the time of the explosion in one of the warehouses, there was about $12 to $50 million worth of medicine and test kits for COVID-19. Those are gone. So suddenly, even the problem, they already had those challenges in terms of finding enough kits for testing and so on. So it's going to increase. Again, if you have lost your family or if you lost your house, the last thing you're going to think about, finding a mask to put on your face. And especially in the first couple of days when people were running into the fire, this is one of the things. Watching people, and I couldn't just stop admiring when there's fire, there's rubble, buildings falling down. People, instead of running away, they were running into it. Just imagine that, running into fire, running into rubbles, because there's an element of humanity. And at that point, you don't even care about COVID-19 and so on. Unfortunately, this could multiply in cases and could lead to more problems, rising cases.
Certainly a difficult task to maintain under normal circumstances. All right, changing gears here. In your opinion, how will the internal chaos change Lebanon's positioning within the broader Middle Eastern, Iran, Saudi, UAE, Turkey dominance with Israel?
None. I don't think it will have any impact. Again, remember, Lebanon, regionally speaking, it is an insignificant player. Rather, it is a playground for other countries to come in and settle their scores there. That being said, we have to make a distinction between correlation and causation. Last week, earlier this week or last week, it was announced that UAE, United Arab Emirates, has just signed an agreement with Israel normalizing their relations. Now, there are a lot of processes happening simultaneously. This does not have anything to do with Lebanon. And Lebanon in this situation, because of the fact that they do not have a strong government, or any government for that matter, they do not have legitimacy. And they're afraid of the repercussions, what would happen if Lebanon were to sign an agreement with Israel as well, a peace agreement. They have a ceasefire agreement, but they don't have. Not to mention the internal dynamics of Hezbollah basically rejecting this, or it's unacceptable for Hezbollah that that's going to happen. So overall, Lebanon's position is not going to change. If anything, probably this could become a financial battleground now for who's going to rebuild, who's going to inject capital. Already people talk about the Chinese government or Chinese investment coming in to build the port. Again, these are all hearsay. Which company will take this? Which company will take that? One hope is that people might realize that they might ease the sanctions on Lebanon, allow foreign currency to come into the country. One of the things, probably not related to this, but one thing to keep in mind, today, if you're a Lebanese citizen and have even, let's say, $100 million in the bank. Of course, if you had $100 million in the bank, you would have most of it outside in offshore. But let's say $100,000 in the bank, in dollars, you are not able to access that money. You cannot take that money out. And people, with the currency devaluation, how are they going to live? Now, one of the issues is that because of this explosion, this might ease this tension or ease the sanctions on Lebanon, and that could basically get things moving economically, at least, and socially and politically. But regionally speaking, I don't think that this is going to have any impact on Lebanon or Lebanese perspective on regional politics.
And bringing it back to Hezbollah, can Lebanon free itself from Hezbollah as a result of this anti-corruption sentiment?
Going back to the short and long answers, no. Again, Hezbollah, a lot of people, and those of you who have taken, alumni who have taken Middle East course with me, we've talked about this a lot. Those of you who are going to take it, we'll talk more about this in the fall. But Hezbollah is, you cannot get rid of Hezbollah, get rid Lebanon of Hezbollah. It's impossible. They are the people. These are not soldiers. They have their barracks and so on. There are some militias, but these are, average people, more often than not, in the south of Lebanon, who by daytime they are carpenters, masons, shopkeepers, and so on. But they do support Hezbollah because Hezbollah itself provides a lot of services. It's not just a militia with, bombs and attacks and so on. They do provide a large array of services to the population, especially the poor, be those social services, garbage collection, reconstruction, mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So I cannot see in the near future any success in getting rid of Hezbollah in Lebanese system.
Trying to switch gears to maybe a more positive note,
I hope.
are there professional opportunities for college-educated millennials in Lebanon? Is there a path forward for the citizens of Lebanon to stay or and
well,
within the country?
You were quick to describe this as positive, but
True.
It's a highly educated country. The number of universities and world-class universities are in Lebanon, be that with American orientation, French orientation, or Lebanese Arabic language universities. They produce a lot of professionals in medicine, in financial services, and so on and so forth. The problem is that, like in many countries like this, you have overqualified people and not enough jobs for them. So they vote with their feet. Most of these, they leave the country. So that is the path. If you want to talk about a path, most common path is for the educated and whoever has an opportunity to leave the country, mostly to France, other countries as well. Some of them do return. Some of them leave with their whole family. So this has been the trend for the last 15 years, even before. Like, the funny thing is that Lebanon did not have outmigration as much as outmigration after the end of the Civil War, as much as it didn't have outmigration during the Civil War as much as it did after the Civil War. A lot of people escaped, left the country during the Civil War up until 1991, 92. Some of them came back, but then in late 90s, the outmigration started more and more. And most of these were professionals who had opportunities, who could find a job overseas.
And is there a multinational corporate presence in Lebanon?
What would that mean? What does multinational corporate mean?
I don't know, perhaps just other opportunities to funnel money into the country to help support relief
I
efforts.
see. Multinational, again, the spearheaded one, the international work or the international conference that was spearheaded by France included many, many countries, including the United States, who pledged, the United States pledged, I don't know, $10, $50 million in aid and so on. So the thing that I haven't been able to wrap my head around is that at current times, and I'm looking at the news, so many problems happening in so many places. Each one has their own problem. The magnitude, unfortunately, this is going to be one news cycle and it would be forgotten. And the people will keep suffering from this. International aid, yes, but to what extent they will put their money where their mouth is. That's another issue.
All right, we're going to take one final question. Do you think the balance between various ethnic religious communities in Lebanon may change after the explosion and during the economic and political crisis? if it does, how would that potentially impact the politics within the country?
Yeah. One thing I expect that it might change is that this is basically, it might transcend the existing confessional political divides in a sense that there are as many Maronites, as many Shias, and as many Sunnis and other denominations who have suffered from this, and who have suffered not from a war or not in the hands of someone else within their community, within that Lebanese fabric, but it was basically they all suffered from criminal negligence or negligence and of an incompetent government. One thing I have been observing, and I do not have enough data for this, and again, Lebanon, like many other countries, there's a lot of hearsay back and forth, this and that, conspiracy theories. One thing that I have been observing, at least now, is that across confessional lines, people gathering. So you would see people who are, the Shia, the Sunni, or the Christian Maronite, this and that, standing shoulder to shoulder in expressing their anger. And also one important thing, the younger generation or this current generation that is in Lebanon, they are not as indoctrinated as the generation prior and the one prior to that. Meaning during the Civil War, it was so easy. Well, you have to be with me because all the Christians or all the Maronites have to stand together. And that wasn't the case. I mean, there was a lot of infighting between Christians as well, within Maronite, within a single sect as well. But that is more or less, or not more or less, but it's less prevalent today. And what really matters is that I don't give a damn if I am a Maronite or a Greek Orthodox or a Druze or a Shia or a Sunni. I have a family to feed, and the government hasn't dealt with this. Oh, you happen to have the same problem. Oh, and you happen to be from a sect that I haven't even heard of before. Well, you know what? Let's get together. This becomes a popular sort of demand. The problem, however, with popular demands, and this last semester before COVID-19, we gave a talk about this, revolutions and social movements and so on. 2019 was full of those, is that sometimes to have a success, or one of the key ingredients of success in this case, is to have an individual leader who embodies that movement. And Lebanon doesn't have that. It is popular movement. There are people, individuals, young people raising, and very funny and very innovative. One of, again, a funny note, but back in October when there were demonstrations going on in Lebanon, there was a story which caught my attention and I loved it, where a woman was driving through the demonstrators with her baby, and the baby was a bit afraid, scared of the noise. So the demonstrators, the protesters, they all started singing the Baby Shark song. And it became the chant of the revolution or the protest. You could hear it, being sung all over. Those are great opportunities for people to come together with a common demand. But if you do not have an individual that could symbolize that, even symbolically, that is one of the biggest challenges. I know we might be running low on time, but one of the things I mentioned earlier, I just wanted to completely irrelevant to this, is that just today, International announced its verdict about the killing of Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, the former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. Everyone has been waiting for this. This is a very sort of explosive, pun intended in this case, a situation, because everyone has been blaming Hezbollah for this, for the assassination, and that could easily turn into a confessional conflict again. According to the International Tribunal, some people are already saying, give us back our money, we don't accept this. In Lebanon, they're talking about this. They didn't find any explicit proof that Hezbollah was behind it. Yes, the people who did commit the act, and they were charged. One of them has been charged, the other 4 have been acquitted. They are members of Hezbollah, and they're at large. The Hezbollah, they're hiding probably in plain sight as well. But this is another dimension that could easily break this solidarity, if you want to call it. So many, the problem with politics and political science, the analysis, you can deal with whatever you have on the ground. You cannot say, according to secret documents, well, if it's secret, how would you know? It's much easier to look at it in retrospect. But with the facts that we have now, with the information that we have now, the trajectory is that there's immense pressure on the government to change their doing things. Strong solidarity among the population that could easily go away if and when aid starts coming into the country and is unevenly distributed. You would see a lot of grievances. But by the same token, there are quite a good chances that this could be a good opportunity for the country to relaunch itself, to reset politically first, but also economically and socially.
Thank you so much. Do you have any, I know that you brought it back to the tribunal from just recently, but do you have any final thoughts to share with our audience before we conclude for today?
I do not actually. I mean, I hope those of you who have any families or relations with Lebanon, stay strong. Whoever had any lost, I sympathize with you. I personally had witnessed some of the losses there. Luckily, not human. But be informed. The only thing I can say, and I thank you, Emily, for this initiative. This is something that you might not agree with my analysis, but be informed, people, about everything, including Lebanon, including everything that is happening around the world, especially now that we have so much disinformation and misinformation about blaming people, about who was responsible for this and that. There's a tragedy. At times of tragedy, your humanity is what matters. You need to have that humanity to help people, and putting everything aside. That's what I would say.
And not to put you on the spot, because I didn't talk to you about this beforehand, but we have a very generous crowd online today. Are there any places that you recommend supporting as part one? And part two is, if people want to get in touch with you directly, can we give out your contact information?
Definitely yes for the second one. Okay. And the first one, I've lost track. I've lost track of how many aids are there. I think the International Red Cross and several other international organizations have been doing a great job. Choose your charity. You can also think about sponsoring families who are individually suffered this. If anyone is interested in doing that, I can put you in touch. You can feel free to contact me. I can put you in touch with 2 or 3 families. Adopt a family, maybe. And one of the things I would like to say, this is my own personal view, when it comes to international aid, yes, there is a need of medicine, food, and so on. But there's also people with specific needs, specific medication, and so on and so forth. That's why I feel that sponsoring an individual or sponsoring a family would be a better way to customize, to make that donation, that help, count more. So feel free to contact me, and I will be more than happy to put you in touch with individuals who need your help, your assistance, and they will appreciate this.
Thank you so much. We've just received another recommendation to check out that I just shared in the chat, so take a look at that before. It's nusaned.org. But certainly do your due diligence, or feel free to reach out to Professor Kotchikian. He will share his contact information in our follow-up email. So be on the lookout for that with a recording of today's session. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wealth of information and knowledge with our alumni and family community. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.